Hi everyone. How's everybody doing? It's lovely to see you guys here despite Storm Dennis out there. My name is Laleh Khalili. I'm actually new to Queen Mary. I taught at SOAS for about 15 years and then switched to Queen Mary last September. And it has been an amazing experience because I actually live in East London myself. So in a way, I feel like I'm in a neighborhood that is part of my everyday life. Now, the little taster that I'm going to be giving is a kind of a compacted summary of a module I teach to third-year students. And it is a module called the Global Politics of Race and Racism, or Race and Racism in Global Politics. And the aim of the module is to actually situate the politics of race and racism, not only in Britain, but more broadly in the world. And what it does is it begins with the history of enslavement, history of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, and tries to connect that to actually other forms of history. So, for example, the Reconquista of Spain, which led to the expulsion of Muslims and Jews there. And in fact, elements of that, I don't know if you've walked around the Queen Mary campus, you can see echoes of that expulsion here on campus. There is a cemetery right in the middle of the campus, which is a cemetery in which Sephardic Jews, the descendants of Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Iberia, from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, are buried. Most of the people that are in the cemetery were died in the last 200 years, but of course, as I said, they are descendants of the Reconquista in 1492. So, in effect, the module is going to be talking about that a lot. What I want to do today, though, is I want to go through a series of different slides in which I'll get to talk to you guys about how race and racism operates not necessarily in everyday face-to-face interactions or in forms of what people nowadays call microaggressions, but to think and talk through the structural effects of racism and the way these structural effects shape the world we live in, shape what we can do, shape what sorts of things, what sorts of resources are available to us or not, and shape the constraints on our abilities and our lives. So, to start with, one of the things that we want to convey in this module is that race is not something that exists a priori. It's not something that is just there, but rather racism creates race. I mean, that sounds a little bit strange, but what we think about as racism is a kind of thinking and sets of structures that transform difference into hierarchies. So, I'm different than you. Difference is difference. But racism transforms that difference into a hierarchy where some people are superior and some are inferior. And this is not just the way we look. It's not just the points of origin. It's not just national difference or differing cultures, but as I mentioned, its origins also go back to, for example, religious forms of discrimination. And it started off, as I said, with the Reconquista in particular and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, but the forms of anti-Semitism that emerged in the 19th century and the forms of Islamophobia that emerged throughout colonialism, especially in Asia, are other forms of racism that we see. So what is also interesting and significant about it is that we know that racism emerges as a means of distinguishing between who rules and who doesn't. It's a system that creates a hierarchy, and therefore it says some people deserve to rule and others don't. Some deserve to be ruled. As Cedric Robinson, who was a wonderful African-American political scientist, wrote, it is a tendency often of European civilization, starting from the 19th century, through capitalism. What the tendency wasn't to homogenize people. It wasn't to actually say everybody is the same, but rather to distinguish people, because those forms of creation of difference not only works in terms of divide and rule, but it also works because it allows for the degrees of hierarchy. And one of the important things that we also try to show is that race and racial difference tends to be also interwoven with gender and with social class. So we talk about all of that in the module, but what I want to do today is I want to actually talk about a few areas in our everyday life where race and racism really affect what we do. So race and technology, things like algorithms, sensors, data mining, surveillance, predictive policing, disposition matrices, and various other things. But also, I think importantly, access to technology. Who can have the resources to be able to reach technology? And when I say who, I don't even mean just simply in a given country, but also globally. So differential accesses to technology. Also, questions of race and housing and property. And one of the things that is very clear in cities, for example, that are gentrifying is the way gentrification often happens along racial lines. But it's also around who has access to mortgages, who has access, who ends up being redlined. This was a particular policy that was very prevalent in the US, but we see elements of it that are analog to the US style of redlining, and I'll talk about this in a moment, here and elsewhere, in Europe, elsewhere actually. Exclusion, questions of social housing, and of course, for example, an instance of this would be Grenfell, where race and racism were absolutely fundamental to the vulnerability of the people who lived in Grenfell, whose complaints about the unsafety, the lack of safety in the building was not listened to, and the outcomes of that. We also talk about race and employment, not only who can find jobs and who can't find jobs, but also what kind of jobs are available to what categories of people. And so there's much recent research that shows, for example, that a lot of precarious care work tends to be feminized and racialized. So jobs that don't pay as much as they should tend to be then pushed onto or populated by people that are often women, but also often people of color. So think about this. A teacher doesn't get paid as much as a banker. And we see the ranks of teachers often populated very extensively by women. In care work, nurses and people who do care, old age care, geriatric care, for example, we see that these particular jobs are overwhelmingly given to women or occupied by women and people of color and also migrants. So it tends to be much more vulnerable, and they don't, despite the fact that these are extremely high-skilled jobs, they require an enormous amount of not only kinds of technical skills. If you're a nurse, you have to have medical skills, but also they require human skills. They require the ability to show sympathy and empathy and care. So you would imagine that a job that has so many high requirements would be paid well, but we also know that nurses are not paid that well. So the other thing that we wanted to, we talk about in class is the way that ecological disasters also tend to be very much racially determined. An example of this, which I'll talk about in a minute, is in Flint, Michigan, which is a city that is overwhelmingly African American. And when there was a decision made to shift their water supplies to a different water supply, it ended up that the water, and I'll show you kind of a horrifying picture, the water that was coming out of the taps was massively full of lead. And this was allowed to go on for a long time while the population at Flint complained, but because they were overwhelmingly African American, they were not listened to. We also see effects of this in Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And we also see the fact that the location, for example, of airports tend to be in heavily minoritized neighborhoods. And so there has been, for example, activism here in Newham Council against City Airport because it causes enormous amounts of air pollution. Same around Heathrow Airport. And it tends to be that these kinds of massive polluting infrastructures often end up being located in places where populations are minorities and people of color. Finally, race and infrastructure. Who gets the good infrastructure? Who benefits from it? and who ends up getting pushed aside in order for some infrastructure to be built. So for example, when roads are built, or when railways are built, whose land ends up getting appropriated for the construction of those infrastructures, and who ends up riding the trains? So I think it is interesting to ask the question of who benefits and who doesn't. So let's start with infrastructures. I'm going to actually start with the back and go forward. This is the water that was coming out of the taps in Flint, Michigan. And this is the water that was coming out of the taps in Detroit, Michigan. What happened there was that Flint, Michigan was the home of enormous factories that used to produce cars. And as car production shifted globally, now that is also around global color lines. The global color line is a term that W.E.B. Du Bois, an amazing African-American sociologist, talked about. They shift, the factories shift locations because they're going to other parts of the world where labor is cheaper and less protected, where it's not unionized, for example. So with all the car factories shifting from Michigan and going overseas, going to other locations, or even going to the US South, where unions are not as significant as they are in the Midwest or in the North, the city ended up having very huge financial problems. And one of the ways in which they decided that they were going to try to address these financial problems was they decided to switch to a different source of municipal water. Now, you would think that that's okay, but no studies were done on the effect of this. And the kind of switch that was made, despite what the scientists told the policymakers, was the kind of switch that was made ended up using pipes that had been left unmaintained over the course of several decades, and which went from water sources that were already deeply and terribly polluted and leaden, full of lead and other kinds of minerals. They switched this. This kind of water literally came out of the tap. People in Flint complained and complained and complained. And even today, this is something like close to 10 years since the disasters happened, the water has not been, the question of the unsafe water has not yet been addressed. And this happens because, as I said, Flint, Michigan tends to be a city that is overwhelmingly African American. And so the voices there are not listened to. Another question that is quite significant is, where are roads and railroads built? I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Which neighborhoods do they separate? Whose lands do they confiscate? One of the interesting things about this is that in many instances, when a railroad is built, the governments that either build the railroad themselves or outsource that to private companies, call up something called eminent domain, meaning the right of the government to confiscate land. Now, you don't go off and confiscate land in places where people have resources and can bring very expensive lawyers to challenge the government. You do it in places where people don't have the ability to challenge the government to the same extent. You might try to mobilize, you might have very vocal activist groups, but often that lack of the differential in resources makes a huge difference. So, for example, when the HS2 was going to be built, a number of the neighborhoods, a number of the housing areas behind Houston were completely knocked down. And in fact, there was a huge amount of activism around that, but it ended up going nowhere. The same thing happened with the neighborhood behind King's Cross and St. Pancras with the extension of the infrastructure there. The same thing has also happened with the extensions of the overground. Now, what is really interesting about this is that both with the HS2 and with the railroad, with the new rail lines that leave out of St. Pancras and King's Cross, we can say, well, these are kinds of infrastructures that we need nationally. And that might be the case, but one of the interesting things about it is also that the people who end up suffering because of it, who end up having their housing taken away from them, are often not the people that get to use those rails, because they, as you probably know, the price of rail travel in this country is so incredibly high that it tends to be particular categories of people who can afford to ride the rail rather than take the bus or the coach from one location to another location. So again, this also tends to be racialized, also in particular because often when these kinds of appropriation of land happens, it happens in densely populated urban areas. And as we know, in the UK, in the US, in most European cities, these densely populated urban centers also tend to be the most diverse. And so that tends to be where these kinds of infrastructural inequities tend to happen. As I mentioned, airports and ports also are enormously polluting kinds of infrastructures necessary for a livelihood, but where they're located and who ends up suffering because of them is also something that we don't often hear about. Now, I recently finished a book about this kind of transport, and I traveled on a container ship several times as part of my research. And one of the things that is really interesting is that you begin to discover that for the construction of the super mega ports that we see today, in most instances, not everywhere, but in most instances, to build those kinds of ports, lots of smaller neighborhoods tend to be erased, tend to be moved, tend to be displaced. And then what does come often produces huge amounts of noise and air pollution, or air pollution, not as much noise in the case of the ports. But that also, in the case of the ports, what you end up having is even in the best regulated waters, for example, here, around Europe, etc., you end up having a degree of pollution added to the waters that emerge around there. And what we see is that in most instances, these ports, as I said, tend to be located in poorer neighborhoods, in poorer areas. And depending on where they are, they can really affect the lives of the people around them in terms of the quality of air, water, and life. Another factor, which I think is really interesting and important, and perhaps more significant in the case of the US, and North America, US and Canada, is the building of pipelines. As you probably know, there's oil being extracted out of the northwestern part of Canada, as well as from shale through fracking in certain parts of the Midwest and the West in the US. One of the very interesting things that when they decided to build a pipeline was that the pipelines, when it was going to go next to some of the larger cities through the different kinds of, in North Dakota, one of the cities, which tend to be where most white Americans live, were circumvented. The pipeline went around them, did not go through them, even though it could have gone through the cities at much lower cost. Instead, they were routed through Native American, indigenous American lands. And there were, I don't know if you remember or not, but there were these enormous, in fact, actually, there are now massive protests also going on in Canada around the Mohawk Nation are protesting in Canada around rails and pipelines. But in this instance, a couple of years back, there were huge protests. There was no Dakota pipeline protest camps, and one of the things that they were saying, the indigenous Americans, was that we want to protect our water. And of course they were laughed at, and the police camps were set on by, the protest camps were set on by the police and police dogs, and it was quite violent. Several people were arrested. And once the protest camps were shut down, within a month there was a massive oil leak from those pipelines. And of course, the people that suffered from that were the indigenous Americans, the Native Americans that were the Sioux Nation in this instance, who had been living around there. Again, in this instance, racial difference made some people vulnerable to pollution, and in other instances didn't. Eco-disasters. one of the most horrifying things is, you guys probably don't remember because you were probably 3 or 4 years old, but your parents might remember, was that when Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans in 2005, about 3,000 people were killed. The 3,000 people that were killed were almost overwhelmingly, or I should say overwhelmingly, not almost, African Americans. In part, this was because of the way that the levee system, the canal system that is supposed to sort of withstand any kind of flooding or massive hurricanes are constructed. New Orleans is a bit like the Netherlands or Belgium. It is extremely low. It's actually lower than sea level, which means you have to put some form of infrastructure in place in order to prevent these areas which are so low, so below the sea level. You need to have these infrastructures that prevent flooding. So if you have ever been to the Netherlands, you'll see canals everywhere. You'll see dikes everywhere, which are little small dams that route the water. And they have water management systems that allow for water to enter reservoirs when it's coming in from the sea, when there's a sea rise because of a storm or because of flooding. And so there's an entire management system around this. There was also a levee system that was built in the 1960s. Actually, it was much older than that, but which was bolstered in the 1960s in New Orleans. And interestingly, what you can see is that most of the people who lived around the levee system were, these areas had poverty levels of more than 40%. And in the US, poverty is very often correlated to race. Not just in the US, but particularly so in Louisiana. And so one of the things that happened was that, like Michigan, money wasn't put into the infrastructures. And so when Hurricane Katrina came through, the infrastructures failed and the levee broke. The levees broke. And so the immediate neighborhoods that were near the levees flooded extraordinarily. And as I said, 3,000 people died. Many were seen and not rescued. When people were trying to break into buildings that were on higher ground, they were shot at by police in helicopter because they said they were looting. So instead of coming to their rescue, they were shooting at people who were trying to break into buildings on higher ground. And so it was this extraordinary scenes in which you heard about these kinds of disasters. And it was very much, as I said, racially determined in the case of Katrina. Another more recent instance is Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico as well as Florida. Puerto Rico has a kind of a complex relationship to the US. It is governed by the US, but it's not a proper state, meaning that its citizens can only vote in certain elections, not all elections, and that they don't benefit from the same degree of rights and access to resources that other ordinary US citizens do. Puerto Rico was colonized by the US at the beginning of the 20th century. And one can see that its treatment as a colony through something that happened a couple of years ago. When Hurricane Maria hit, a city, you can see this was the nighttime light grid. Before and after. So electricity grids were knocked out. And while the same kinds of effect ended up happening also in Florida and some of the other states on the coast of the Atlantic, those were fixed almost right away. Parts of Puerto Rico still don't have electricity 2 years later. And this has been a kind of a point of massive contention. In the case of the US, environmental racism happens in all sorts of places. Toxic waste is often dumped both domestically and internationally in different places that are constituted, where the people are constituted as less valuable. So we know, for example, that all of our rubbish, all of our electronic rubbish, ends up in dumps in the global south. And many of course, the electronic rubbish that we have are full of mercury and other kinds of toxic materials. And of course, people pick through them. And so in a way, we're sending our waste overseas. But also, at home, they tend to go into neighborhoods, into places where people don't have the power to challenge them, or where actually in some places the leadership of particular communities are so desperate for a source of income that they're willing to accept toxic material into their neighborhoods just to have a source of income. So environmental racism is something quite real. Another one that I quite find interesting is that about 20 years ago, there was a statistic that if you started in East London and you went to West London on the Central Line, you would have 1 year added to people's life expectancy for every station that you went west. Now, that is an extraordinary, this was 20 years ago. This particular, and I don't think you can see it because it's very small, but if you type that into Google, you'll find it. A recent study from UCL, conducted within the last 3 or 4 years, still looks at life expectancy along the east-west axis in London. And what you find is that, for example, in Mile End, where we are, life expectancy is 78. But in Oxford Circus, it's 96. I mean, that's a really, and then as you go further west, it also again drops. So in Ruislip, you end up having 81. And this is obviously average life expectancy taken, but often that life expectancy correlates to affluence and race. This is one of the most amazing things ever. And one can say it is really fantastic that it has really changed so that it's not, the difference is not the 20 years of however many, the 20-year, 30-year difference in life expectancy that it was 20 years ago. But still, I think it's quite a shocking thing that in this part of central London, life expectancy runs between 87 to 91, and then in parts of it is 76, 78. Employment is another area. I already talked about discrimination in hiring, but there's also what is called the intersectional wage gap. We know that women earn less than men on average, but we also know that women of color earn less than white women everywhere where there is this kind of wage differential. We also know that this kind of an intersectional wage gap, where your race, your gender, and social class affects this. It is something that happens in a lot of places. And although policies tend to try to address them, they often do so only in response to political organization for it. So activism around that, bringing it to light, tends to be something that is quite important. As I mentioned, engagement in care work is often feminized and underpaid. And in particular, it also brings in often quite vulnerable migrant populations. So these vulnerable migrant populations are hired into jobs that are absolutely necessary, that do provide extraordinary and enormously important work, but which are heavily underpaid. The NHS, for example, couldn't operate without the input of nurses that are brought over from lots of different parts of the world. And precarity and uncertainty is also something that is much more significant. So the gig economy, which often people tout as being this wonderful thing, also tends to be very racialized. Who drives your Uber? Who drives your Deliveroo bike? Who does the kind of deliveries that you receive when Amazon, when e-commerce takes over? Just take a look at that. And these kinds of almost invisible to us, we take them to be essentially just the way world works. They tend to be often migrant populations and or populations of people of color. So in precarious gig economy works, again, the racial difference dominates. Housing, I mean, that's a very famous picture of Grenfell. But the question of housing and the quality of the housing continues to be of enormous importance. We know that loads of councils have social housing that are covered in the same kind of cladding that caught on fire there. We know that that cladding has, for example, been banned in the US. And yet, we don't see this cladding being replaced or removed. And this tends to be, well, actually, it is always by social class, but it also tends to be dominantly in, again, high-density urban neighborhoods, which means that class ends up intersecting with race. I also just looked up some particular statistics from recent reports produced by the Office of National Statistics, but I also included that picture. And what I found that really interesting about that is, of course, because that picture is from Nottingham circa 1960s, is the way that racialization, as I said before, doesn't necessarily have to do with one's color of skin. It can be all sorts of categorical things that can be included in those forms of racialization. And we know that, for example, in the history of this country, the Irish were often hierarchized. They were made to essentially occupy the lower rungs. And so what you ended up seeing in Notting Hill was this no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Housing discrimination. We also see this in home ownership statistics, which indicates access to resources, access to mortgages. In the case of the US, there's something that is called redlining. In fact, if you follow US politics right now, Michael Bloomberg is being criticized because a video of him has surfaced where he defends redlining. And redlining is when banks drew lines, essentially red lines, around neighborhoods that were predominantly African American and did not offer mortgages there, until laws were passed to remove redlining. And then the kinds of mortgages that were offered were the kind of subprime mortgages that then crashed in 2008. And loads of African Americans lost their homes because obviously they were unable to pay their mortgages at that stage. So what you ended up seeing was that you lost no matter what happened. You were either not able to get mortgages, or you get, excuse the language, shitty mortgages that when the market crashed, essentially ended up disadvantaging those people who held them. Technology is another element that I really like to talk about. Has anybody here, who's a person of color, ever stuck their hand under a water spout, one of these automatic censored water, and not have had water come out? There are actually studies that show that these sensors do not always detect movement when a person is not white. They also recently have discovered that the sensors on self-driving cars do not they are more likely to drive into black people because they do not detect non-white people. I mean, that is kind of a crazy thing, because you would have thought that this would be fairly easy, but in part it is because the same way that James talked about how Viagra was tested on women, or birth control pills, contraceptives, were tested on men. There were particular categories of people for whom data was not gathered. And in order for your sensors to work, your sensors would have to have access to an enormous database in order for it to be able to. That's how algorithms work. And so that was quite an interesting one. But another factor that I think is really interesting, and this is actually in the case of the UK, access to internet is actually one of the ones where it is much more complex in terms of racial access. And that is because rural areas in this country have extremely bad internet when compared with city centers. And of course, rural areas in this country tend to be predominantly white. So this is one of those things where you end up having a slightly different kind of racial difference, but it is one that affects people. But also, the technology thing is interesting because, of course, internet, as you know, is not just something that flows up in the sky. You have to have internet cables. And often you have to have global sub-oceanic internet cables that connect everything to everybody. And there's been recent interesting historical studies that have shown that the path that internet cables follow underwater in the world's oceans are actually laid in the same places that the telegraph cables were laid in the 19th century. And of course, as you probably know, telegraph cables were laid in order to connect the colonial powers of Europe to their colonies. And so there was a particular kind of colonial history that already inheres into who gets good access to internet because they have the cable landing sites on their lands, on their borders. Finally, policing is, of course, we also know it's racialized. Again, this is another one of those things that Michael Bloomberg in the US right now is being criticized for his stop and frisk program. But it also, this is one of the interesting statistics that, did I not include that? No, I didn't include this. This is just about the possession. But there was a very interesting bar chart that showed that actually the percentage of cocaine use among the black community in Britain was far smaller than the percentage of cocaine use was in the white community, and yet arrests and convictions for the black community were completely disproportionate. So policing also tends to be heavily racialized. And we know this again and again because there has been, of course, the studies and the activism around Stephen Lawrence's experience, but also because we do here, we can see the statistics quite significantly here. Now, we've got 5 minutes, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I'm not entirely sure what you're supposed to do after that. Any questions? Yeah?
On the subject of the policing thing,
yeah.
What would you say about how the government, they deported those Jamaican people? Because I remember one of them served a criminal, like a jail sentence for drugs. And he got deported even though he served that, and he was in the UK since he was 5, whereas white people in government, such as Michael Gove, have admitted to using Class A drugs.
And Boris Johnson.
Yeah, and they're leading our country. Now, what would you say about that?
So I think that that is also, citizenship is actually one of the things that we do talk about in this module quite extensively. And we talk about unequal citizenship. And who has access to citizenship and who doesn't. So one of the questions that I saw on Twitter when the plane ended up taking off for Jamaica a couple of days ago was that how many planes are taking off with people that have been convicted of similar kinds of offenses? How many of these planes are taking off to places like Australia or the US or New Zealand? And we don't, of course, see that. So this is part and parcel of the whole hostile environment kind of, so it's as much to do with immigration control as it does with policing. In the sense that we know that the Tory government has had a hostile environment policies. Let's create an environment that is hostile to migrants, that makes it unequal kind of access to resources. And what ends up then translating into migrant communities are actually British people who happen to be of color. So it ends up kind of casting a very wide net, which also catches in it lots of people that don't necessarily belong in there. To me, the one element of the one story that I heard wasn't even about drug offenses. It was a guy that had been caught for dangerous driving, had served some months for dangerous driving. Nobody had been hurt. There had been no damage. And he had finished serving his time. And he was also deported. To me, that was quite a kind of a shocking thing. Because there's a certain degree of moralism that is tied up with the question of drug use. But the fact that somebody who was caught speeding, but who had hurt no one, and who had damaged nothing ends up being deported for driving offenses. So obviously there's an element of race that also operates in this kind of a convergence between policing and migration control. Yeah?
Sorry, also, on the topic of citizenship as well, do you think that our government has the right to take someone's citizenship away?
So that's a very interesting one, because it is, of course, emerging in the wake of the ISIS Shamima Begum's situation. I don't, but there's a huge number of debates that are involved around this. And of course, that also goes to the question of unequal citizenship, because it goes to say who gets to have their citizenship stripped from them and who doesn't. And to me, that's also interesting because, for example, if a US citizen, a white US citizen who has lived here for a number of years and commits some horrendous offense, does not have their citizenship stripped from them and sent back to the US. They often are allowed to remain. Whereas in this instance, a woman whose parents were of Bangladeshi origin, who herself has never been to Bangladesh, ends up being, despite committing all sorts of God knows what, she should have been tried here rather than have her citizenship stripped. And so to me, that's also really interesting, because that has become a way, in my opinion, to sort of control populations. It is, and again, part of the whole hostile environment factor, which targets not only immigrants, but also citizens of color, citizens and residents of color. So.
Not completely going away from the whole citizenship thing, do you think citizenship should be a right or a privilege?
I mean, that's a very difficult one to say, because I think the way that we look at citizenship is that it's not neither a right nor a privilege. It's a contract between a person and the government. So you both have rights and obligations. You both have duties and benefits that you get from it. Obviously, as citizens, we pay taxes, we work, we contribute to the GDP, etc. And I think that there is, in some senses, once you have been granted a citizenship, there has to be some degree of certainty that that citizenship can remain yours, and that you will be treated in law the same way as a citizen that was born here or that was several generations back. I think when you don't, then you're going to end up having unequal citizenships, and multi-tiered citizenship is never a good thing in any setting. The same laws should apply to everybody, essentially. Okay. If you don't have any other questions or don't want to ask them in public, I'm quite happy to stay here for just 5 or 6 minutes. I don't know, as I said, I don't know what they're going to do for you guys now. And I'll be happy to chat with anybody who would like. Great. Thank you very much.